In court, the judge laughs at the black janitor, convinced that he knows nothing about the law. But when he decides to humiliate him, he doesn't even realize that the janitor is a genius. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. The heavy doors of the Cook County Courthouse opened with their usual reluctant groan, releasing a stream of sharply dressed men and women into the morning chill of downtown Chicago. The steady rhythm of polished shoes clicking against marble floors echoed through the grand corridors, mingling with the low murmur of legal jargon, hurried conversations, and the occasional bark of an impatient judge. Beneath the ornate ceilings and beneath the glances exchanged by lawyers and clerks, another figure moved quietly, unnoticed by most and deliberately ignored by the rest. His name was Marcus Walker, but in this place, he might as well have been invisible. Marcus pushed his cleaning cart down the hall with the same practiced silence he had perfected over the years. The wheels squeaked faintly every few steps, but the sound was lost beneath the more important noises of the courthouse. He wore the standard blue uniform issued to maintenance staff, the letters Facility Services stitched in white over his chest, a name tag beneath it that few bothered to read. His dark skin and worn face blended into the background like another fixture of the building, as ordinary and overlooked as the mop in his hand. Each morning began the same way. He arrived before sunrise, crossing the nearly empty lobby with his head down and his steps measured, careful not to disturb the early arrivals. He swept the floors, wiped down the benches, emptied the trash bins. He knew every crack in the marble, every scuff on the walls, every corner where dust liked to settle. The lawyers and clerks passed him without acknowledgement, sometimes sidestepping him as if he might be contagious, more often pretending he wasn't there at all. It did not bother Marcus anymore. He had long ago grown accustomed to the particular brand of indifference that ruled places like this. It wasn't personal. It was structural, systemic, and as old as the courthouse itself. People like him existed on the periphery, useful only when invisible. But invisibility had its advantages. While they dismissed him, Marcus watched everything. Each day he listened without appearing to listen, catching snippets of conversation as lawyers debated strategy and judges muttered to clerks about deadlines and filings. He memorized faces, names, cases. He learned the rhythm of the court, how voices rose and fell, how arguments were built and dismantled. And when his shift ended, when the last trash can had been emptied and the last spill cleaned, he returned to his one-room apartment in the South Side, opened a battered notebook, and wrote down everything he had heard. The walls of his apartment were bare, the furniture sparse. A cot in the corner, a second-hand table littered with papers, a bookshelf scavenged from a junkyard now sagging beneath the weight of old law books, borrowed and sometimes rescued from the trash outside the courthouse library. Most of them were outdated editions, their spines cracked and their pages yellowed, but Marcus treated them like gold. At night, when the city quieted and no one needed him to clean or disappear, he sat at his table under the dim glow of a single lamp, reading case law and legal theory with the intensity of a starving man consuming his first meal in days. He annotated margins, cross-referenced statutes, traced the evolution of precedents. The language of the law, dense and labyrinthine, became clearer with each passing year. Each page turned. He never told anyone about his obsession. What would be the point? No one in his world cared that he could recite sections of the Illinois Code of Civil Procedure by heart or explain the difference between a demurrer and a motion to dismiss. They saw a janitor, and janitors didn't read law books. On certain days when the courthouse was particularly busy and no one paid him any mind, Marcus lingered near courtroom 7C, the largest and most prestigious in the building. It was presided over by Judge John Hawkins, a man who had become something of a legend in the legal community. Silver-haired, sharp-tongued, and fiercely intelligent, Hawkins ruled his courtroom like a general leading an army. His opinions were cited in journals. His remarks during hearings were often quoted in the press. Hawkins was also known for his disdain towards those he considered beneath him, a category that included not just the defendants who stood trembling before his bench, but anyone without pedigree or formal credentials. To him, the law was an exclusive club, membership granted only to those who had paid the price of admission in tuition and lineage. Marcus had observed Hawkins long enough to know the measure of the man. He admired the judge's intellect, but recognized the cracks in his character, the quick dismissal of the poor, the way he mocked public defenders, the thinly veiled contempt in his tone when addressing those without titles. On one particular morning, a case had begun to draw attention even outside the courthouse. A massive corporate fraud scandal involving millions of dollars and powerful executives. Journalists crowded the steps outside, reporters with cameras lingered in the lobby. Inside, teams of high-priced lawyers prepared their strategies, and Judge Hawkins was slated to preside. Marcus moved quietly through the building that day, more attentive than usual. As he mopped the hallway outside the judge's chambers, he caught fragments of conversation, the tension in the voices, the uncertainty masked by polished legal terms. He filed it all away. Later that afternoon, when the courtroom emptied for a recess, Marcus slipped inside, ostensibly to wipe down the gallery benches. The lawyers remained gathered near the front, speaking in low tones. Among them stood Judge Hawkins, tall and composed, his arms crossed, a slight smirk on his lips as he listened to the legal teams argue over a motion. From the back of the courtroom, Marcus watched, unnoticed. It wasn't the first time he had observed them, but something in the atmosphere felt different today. He could sense the strain beneath the polished words, the cracks in the case that the lawyers failed to see. His mind, conditioned over years of study and quiet observation, began to piece together the flaws. He lingered longer than he should have, forgetting for a moment the mop in his hand and the uniform on his back. And it was in that moment that Judge Hawkins noticed him. The judge's gaze slid over to the rear of the courtroom, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the figure standing near the gallery rail. For a brief second, Marcus saw something flicker across the judge's face. Annoyance, perhaps, or something colder. Their eyes met. Marcus quickly lowered his gaze and resumed wiping the benches, but it was too late. The judge's voice cut across the quiet murmur of conversation. "Is our maintenance staff taking a sudden interest in the law?" Hawkins said, his tone dry, laced with condescension. The lawyers chuckled politely. Marcus kept his head down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, the flush of shame mixed with anger, but he gave no outward sign. The moment passed, the conversation resumed, and Marcus finished his work without further interruption. But something had shifted. That night, in his apartment, Marcus sat longer than usual at his desk, staring at the worn cover of the law book in front of him. The judge's voice echoed in his mind, the mocking tone, the dismissive laughter. He knew it shouldn't matter. He had endured worse. But it did matter, because for the first time the invisible man had been seen, not for what he was, but for what they assumed he wasn't. The next morning, the courthouse bustled as usual. The fraud trial continued, reporters waited outside, clerks scurried back and forth, and Marcus, mop in hand, returned to courtroom 7C, knowing that something unseen had begun to stir beneath the surface of his quiet, ordered life. He did not yet know that a line had been crossed, one that could not be uncrossed, and that the man who had laughed at him would soon come to regret ever noticing the janitor in the corner. But the wheels were already turning, and there was no stopping them now. The following days unfolded like clockwork inside the courthouse, each minute slotting neatly into the machinery of justice that never stopped grinding. The fraud trial that had stirred so much attention was in full swing now, the courtroom packed every morning with attorneys, reporters, and spectators eager to witness the fall of men who had once stood at the pinnacle of power. The tension in courtroom 7C grew heavier with each session, the air charged with the gravity of millions of dollars in careers hanging in the balance. Marcus continued to move silently through the building, his cleaning cart an extension of himself, the mop in his hand almost invisible as he pushed it along polished floors. Yet, beneath the quiet surface, his mind was restless. The exchange from days earlier lingered like a stone in his shoe, the judge's mocking tone replaying itself at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night when he could not sleep. It wasn't just the words that had unsettled him, but the laughter, the way the entire room had joined in, dismissing him with a single glance and a smirk. He told himself it didn't matter. It shouldn't matter. He had built his life on invisibility, surviving by staying unnoticed. Yet, something about the way Judge Hawkins had looked at him had cracked that shield. It was late afternoon when the moment came, as unexpected and sharp as a slap. The courtroom had emptied for recess, and Marcus had entered quietly, as he always did, to wipe down the benches and clear away stray papers. He moved methodically, his back bent, his eyes lowered, careful to stay out of sight. But this time, someone was watching. A low chuckle echoed from the front of the room. Marcus glanced up and saw Judge Hawkins standing near the bench, speaking with several attorneys. Their conversation paused as the judge's gaze fixed on Marcus, a thin smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "Well, look who's back," Hawkins said, his voice carrying easily in the near-empty room. "Our resident legal scholar." The attorneys turned, following the judge's gaze, their expressions shifting from curiosity to amusement. Marcus froze, his hands tightening on the handle of his mop. "You seem to have a keen interest in our little proceedings," Hawkins continued, the smirk deepening. "Tell me, have you found any errors in our arguments today? Or perhaps you've devised a better defense for the accused?" The attorneys laughed, not maliciously, but with the easy condescension of men who knew the hierarchy of the world and their place in it. Marcus said nothing. He kept his eyes on the floor, his face expressionless. The judge wasn't done. "Come now," Hawkins said, waving a hand as if inviting a stray dog to perform a trick. "You're always listening so intently. Surely you must have some insight to offer." One of the younger lawyers added, "Maybe he's ready to take the bar exam." More laughter followed. Marcus felt the heat rise in his face, but he forced himself to remain still, his posture rigid, his lips pressed tightly together. He had learned long ago that reacting only fed the fire. The judge stepped down from the bench, approaching slowly, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "Tell you what," Hawkins said, his tone light, almost playful. "Since you're so eager to learn, let's make this interesting." He turned to one of the clerks and gestured. The clerk, caught off guard, scrambled to fetch a manila folder from the table and handed it to the judge. Hawkins flipped it open, skimming the contents, then glanced back at Marcus. "This," he said, holding the folder aloft, "is a hypothetical case we discussed over lunch. A simple little problem, nothing too complex. Let's see if our janitor can crack it." The attorneys chuckled again, the sound bouncing off the marble walls like a ripple of derision. Hawkins walked over and extended the folder toward Marcus. "Here," he said, "give it a read. Tell us what you would do if you were an attorney." Marcus hesitated, his eyes flickering from the folder to the judge's face. There was no kindness in Hawkins' expression, only challenge and mockery, a dare wrapped in contempt. He should have declined. He knew it in his bones. Nothing good would come from engaging in this performance. But something inside him, something old and stubborn, refused to bow. Marcus reached out and took the folder, careful not to let his fingers brush against the judge's. The room fell quiet. He opened the folder and scanned the first page. It was a short scenario, the details neatly typed. A client is accused of fraud. There exists a clause in the signed contract that, if interpreted correctly, may exonerate him. The defense has overlooked it. Identify the flaw and explain how it could be used to dismiss the charges. Marcus's pulse quickened as he read. He recognized the shape of the problem immediately, the way the language had been twisted, the gap left open like a trap door. Years of reading legal documents, analyzing cases late into the night, had trained his mind to see such things. He closed the folder carefully and looked up, meeting the judge's gaze. "The clause is buried in the indemnification section," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. "It specifies that the client cannot be held liable if he acted on information provided by a third party without knowledge of its falsehood. The prosecution's case hinges on the assumption of intent, but if the clause is invoked correctly, it shifts the burden of proof." The room remained silent. One of the attorneys frowned, moving closer to the judge to glance at the folder. Another furrowed his brow, his amusement fading. Hawkins' smile thinned, the corners of his mouth tightening almost imperceptibly. Marcus handed the folder back without another word, then returned to his cart and resumed wiping the benches, his posture unchanged, his expression blank. The judge watched him for a long moment, then turned on his heel and walked away, the attorneys trailing behind him, their conversation hushed now, their laughter absent. The courtroom emptied, leaving Marcus alone with the echo of their footsteps and the weight of what had just transpired. That night, in his apartment, he couldn't concentrate on the book spread across his table. The pages blurred before his eyes, the words meaningless. His mind kept returning to the courtroom, to the stunned silence, to the faint edge in Hawkins's voice when he had acknowledged the flaw. It wasn't pride that kept him awake. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something else, something heavier. For years, Marcus had built walls around himself, content to be invisible, safe in the knowledge that no one expected anything from him. But now, those walls had begun to crack, and he wasn't sure what lay beyond them. He closed the book and sat back, staring at the ceiling. He knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning, and he had no idea where it would end. The next morning arrived with the same mechanical rhythm that governed every day in the courthouse, but for Marcus, the air felt heavier, thicker, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the weather or the routine. The events of the previous afternoon lingered in his mind like a splinter lodged beneath the skin, small enough to overlook but impossible to ignore. He had spent the night replaying every moment, every word, every glance from the people who had laughed at him, and the moment when that laughter had died in their throats. What troubled him most was not their silence, but what it meant. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He entered the courthouse early, as always, his footsteps measured and deliberate. The marble floors gleamed under the flicker of overhead lights, the morning hush broken only by the distant clatter of carts, the low murmur of clerks, the faint hum of fluorescent bulbs. To anyone watching, Marcus looked the same as he always had. The janitor in a blue uniform, mop in hand, gaze lowered, careful not to disturb the real work of the building. But something inside him had shifted. He kept his head down as he passed the front desk, the elevator lobby, the long hallways lined with framed portraits of retired judges. No one greeted him. No one paused to look. Yet he could feel the undercurrent in the air, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When he reached the maintenance closet tucked behind the north stairwell, he leaned against the door for a moment before stepping inside. The small, windowless space was cluttered with brooms, mops, bottles of industrial cleaner stacked neatly on wire shelves. In the far corner sat his worn canvas bag, the one he carried to and from work every day. Inside, folded carefully beneath a spare shirt, was the manila folder Judge Hawkins had handed him the day before. He had read it again that night after returning home, as if to convince himself it had been real. The scenario had been simple on the surface, a case study, fictional and harmless, but within it, Marcus had seen something no one else had. He had recognized the weakness in the prosecution's argument not because he was lucky, but because he had spent years training his mind to look for such things. It had not been an accident. It had been inevitable. By the time the courthouse filled with the usual din of lawyers, clerks, and reporters, Marcus was already moving through the building, completing his duties without pause. He emptied trash bins, wiped counters, mopped hallways. He exchanged polite nods with the security guards, avoided the eyes of the clerks, kept to the periphery like he always had. But as he passed by courtroom 7C, he slowed. Inside, the attorneys from the fraud trial gathered near the front, their voices low, their postures tense. Judge Hawkins sat at the bench, flipping through a file, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was not yet open to the public. The doors remained ajar, but the session had not begun. Marcus paused outside, his hand tightening slightly on the handle of his cart. He didn't intend to linger, but before he could move on, he heard his name. Walker. The voice was unmistakable. Sharp, commanding, familiar. Marcus turned. Judge Hawkins stood at the threshold, one eyebrow raised, the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Step inside," the judge said. For a moment, Marcus considered turning away, pretending not to hear. But something in Hawkins' gaze told him that would not be an option. He left his cart by the door and walked into the courtroom. The attorneys glanced up, their expressions shifting as they recognized him. There were no smiles this time, no laughter. Only watchfulness, curiosity, and something else, unease. Hawkins motioned toward the bench. "Yesterday," the judge began, his tone even, "you pointed out an error in a hypothetical case. You did it quickly, without hesitation." Marcus said nothing. Hawkins tapped the file in front of him. "That wasn't just luck," the judge continued. "You saw something seasoned lawyers missed." The attorneys exchanged glances, but none spoke. Hawkins leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, Mr. Walker," he said, "how does a janitor come to recognize a contractual loophole in a fraud case?" The question was rhetorical, but Marcus understood the weight behind it. He met the judge's gaze and answered quietly. "I read." A murmur rippled through the attorneys. Hawkins studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Very well," he said. "Let's see how much you read." He gestured to the clerk, who handed him another folder. Hawkins opened it, skimming the contents before sliding it across the table toward Marcus. "This," the judge said, "is not hypothetical. It's an active case, though I've redacted the identifying details. Take a look." Marcus hesitated, then stepped forward and took the folder. Inside were copies of a contract, filings, procedural motions. The pages were dense, technical, filled with the kind of language designed to confuse and obfuscate. It was the language of power, of exclusion. He flipped through the documents, scanning each page quickly but carefully. The structure of the case unfolded in his mind like a map. Two parties locked in a dispute over contractual obligations, a compensation clause buried deep in the fine print, a motion to dismiss based on breach of terms. Marcus's brow furrowed. The attorneys watched him, some with skepticism, others with open discomfort. This was not supposed to happen. Janitors were not supposed to read legal documents, let alone understand them. After several minutes, Marcus closed the folder and looked up. "There's a flaw," he said quietly. Hawkins raised an eyebrow. "Is there?" Marcus nodded. "In the compensation clause," he said. "It's tied to performance metrics that were never clearly defined in the original agreement. That ambiguity undermines the entire basis for the breach claim. If challenged, the case could collapse." The room was silent. One of the attorneys stepped forward, frowning. "That's not possible," he said. "We've reviewed that contract a dozen times." Marcus said nothing. Hawkins reached for the folder, flipping to the page Marcus had referenced. His eyes scanned the text, his expression tightening as he read. He glanced up, meeting Marcus's gaze. "You're correct," the judge said finally. "The clause is ambiguous. It's grounds for dismissal." The attorneys shifted uncomfortably, avoiding one another's eyes. Hawkins closed the folder and set it aside. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," he said quietly. "You may go." Marcus nodded once, turned, and left the courtroom without another word. Outside, the hallway buzzed with the usual activity, but Marcus moved through it as if insulated from the noise. He retrieved his cart and resumed his duties, his face impassive. But inside, the splinter had become something larger, something impossible to ignore. That evening, after the courthouse emptied and the city's lights blinked to life beyond his apartment window, Marcus sat at his table, staring at the worn covers of his law books. He had spent years teaching himself to see patterns, to understand the rules of a game that was never meant for him. Now, for the first time, someone had seen him, and it terrified him more than he cared to admit. In the silence of his apartment, with the hum of traffic below and the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders, he realized he stood at the edge of something he could not yet name. A door had opened, and whether he chose to walk through it or not, nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed settled into a strange, dissonant rhythm for Marcus. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Each morning, he arrived at the courthouse before the sun crested the skyline, slipping through the grand revolving doors like a shadow, his uniform pressed, his posture unassuming. He pushed his cart along the same marble hallways, wiped the same fingerprints from glass doors, emptied the same bins filled with discarded papers, coffee cups, and candy wrappers. To the world around him, he remained the same invisible man he had always been. But beneath the surface, the ground had shifted. People glanced at him now, not many, not often, but enough for him to notice. Clerks paused mid-conversation when he passed by, their eyes following him a second longer than necessary. Young attorneys who once brushed past without acknowledgement now exchanged hushed words when he lingered near. It wasn't respect he saw in their glances. It was discomfort, confusion, curiosity edged with something else, something sharper. He had become, without intending to, an anomaly in a system built on order and hierarchy. And Judge Hawkins had not spoken to him since. That absence weighed heavier than any stare or whispered conversation. Marcus sensed the judge's presence like a distant storm, a pressure that built with each passing day, though no words were exchanged. It left him suspended, waiting for something he couldn't quite define. The waiting ended on a Tuesday evening, long after the courthouse had emptied and the echo of footsteps faded into the night. Marcus had just finished mopping the main hallway outside courtroom 7C when the sound of a door opening broke the quiet. He glanced up to see Judge Hawkins standing in the doorway, his black robe shed, his shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms. The judge's face was unreadable, his gaze steady. "Mr. Walker," Hawkins said simply, his voice low but carrying. Marcus straightened, setting the mop aside. "Your Honor," he replied, careful to keep his tone neutral. "Come with me." The judge turned without waiting for a response and walked down the hallway, his steps measured, unhurried. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before following. They moved in silence, neither speaking as they climbed a narrow staircase and crossed the upper floor toward the judge's private chambers. Hawkins unlocked the door and gestured for Marcus to enter. The office was nothing like the cavernous courtroom below. It was smaller, quieter, lined with shelves heavy with legal text, framed certificates, and photographs of court gatherings long past. A large wooden desk sat near the window, papers neatly stacked, a green-shaded lamp casting a pool of light across the surface. Hawkins walked around the desk and sat, motioning for Marcus to take the chair opposite. Marcus obeyed, folding his hands carefully in his lap. For a long moment, the judge said nothing, studying him as if trying to see through the layers of armor that Marcus had spent years constructing. Finally, Hawkins spoke. "You're not like the others," he said quietly. Marcus offered no reply. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I've seen men bluff their way through law school, charm their way into firms, rise on the backs of privilege and connections," Hawkins continued. "But you," he shook his head, "you read, you see, and you understand." The words lingered in the air, heavy and deliberate. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, unsure where the conversation was leading. Hawkins reached into a drawer and withdrew a folder, sliding it across the desk. "This is another case file," he said. "Real, ongoing, though I've removed any identifying details. I want you to analyze it." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Why?" he asked quietly. The judge's gaze remained steady. "Because I need to know if what I saw in that courtroom was a fluke or something more." Marcus hesitated, then reached for the folder, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, the familiar language of contracts and filings filling his vision. Hawkins watched him for a moment before speaking again. "If you can produce a coherent analysis," he said, "I'll make you an offer." Marcus glanced up. "What kind of offer?" The judge's expression was unreadable, one that could change your life. He left it at that. Marcus closed the folder, his heart pounding quietly in his chest. "I'll need time," he said. Hawkins nodded. "You have until Friday." The conversation ended there, the judge returning to his paperwork, Marcus slipping from the room without another word. That night, back in his apartment, Marcus sat at his table long after midnight, the folder open before him. The case was complicated. more intricate than the previous ones, tangled with procedural errors, contractual disputes, and a timeline that looped in on itself like a maze. He read every page twice, then a third time, scribbling notes in his battered notebook, cross-referencing terms and precedents he had committed to memory. The work consumed him. During the day, he completed his duties mechanically, moving through the courthouse like a ghost, his thoughts always on the pages waiting for him at home. He barely noticed the glances of others now, the whispered conversations that ceased when he entered a room. All that mattered was the challenge before him. By Thursday evening, he had drafted his analysis, 12 pages of tightly reasoned argument outlining procedural flaws, contractual ambiguities, and recommended strategies for dismissal. He reviewed it 3 times, correcting each line, polishing every word until it was precise. On Friday morning, he delivered the folder to Judge Hawkins's chambers without ceremony, sliding it across the desk without meeting the judge's eyes. The judge accepted it silently. For the rest of the day, Marcus worked in a fog of anticipation, his heart beating steadily beneath his uniform as he scrubbed floors, emptied bins, wiped down handrails. He told himself it didn't matter, that nothing would change, that the judge would read his analysis, nod, and dismiss him back to the shadows where he belonged. But when he returned to the maintenance closet that evening, a note was taped to the inside of the door. "Come to my office. Now." It was signed with a single initial, H. He climbed the stairs slowly, his steps heavier than usual, his thoughts tangled. Hawkins was waiting when he arrived, the folder open on his desk, a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow. He didn't look up immediately, flipping the last page of Marcus's analysis before closing the folder with a quiet finality. The judge gestured to the CA to the chair across from him. "Sit." Marcus obeyed. For a long moment, Hawkins said nothing, tapping his fingers lightly against the folder's cover. "This," he said finally, "is good work. Better than good." He looked up, his gaze sharp. "How long have you been teaching yourself the law?" Marcus hesitated, then answered, "Years." The judge nodded once, as if confirming something he already suspected. "You could have been a lawyer," Hawkins said quietly, "if you'd had the chance." Marcus said nothing. The judge leaned back in his chair. "I can't change the past," he continued, "but I can offer you something now." He folded his hands. "I want you to work for me," he said simply. "Not as a janitor, as my assistant. Informally, at first. You'll continue your duties here, but—" The air inside Judge Hawkins' office had felt heavier when Marcus left it that Friday evening. The judge's proposition had hung between them like a verdict yet to be delivered, and though Hawkins had spoken quietly, almost matter-of-factly, Marcus understood the weight of what had been offered. An informal position, a chance to step beyond the boundary that had always separated him from the world of men in robes and suits. It was not a promise, not yet, but a door left slightly ajar. Whether he chose to walk through it would define everything that followed. The weekend passed in a haze of restless thoughts and rehearsed arguments. Marcus paced the length of his apartment more times than he could count, weighing the consequences of accepting the judge's offer. It was not simply a matter of time or labor. He knew instinctively that stepping into the judge's shadow meant exposing himself to scrutiny, to the cold, dissecting stares of men who had already decided who he was and where he belonged. He knew what it meant to be watched, but he also knew what it felt like to be ignored, and he was no longer sure which was worse. By Monday morning, his decision was made. He arrived at the courthouse before dawn, as always, the weight of his uniform sitting heavier on his shoulders than usual. The building felt different now, familiar and foreign all at once. He went about his duties quietly, but his mind was elsewhere, anticipating the conversation that would come. It came sooner than expected. Shortly after noon, as he polished the brass railing outside the clerk's office, a court officer approached him. A young man Marcus recognized but had never exchanged more than a nod with. "The judge wants to see you," the officer said, his tone clipped, almost perfunctory. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and followed without a word. When he entered Hawkins's chambers, the judge did not look up immediately. Papers were spread across the desk, a pen tapping rhythmically against one edge. Marcus stood silently until Hawkins glanced up and motioned him to sit. "Well," the judge said after a moment. Marcus met his gaze evenly. "I'll do it." There was no smile, no outward sign of approval, but the tapping of the pen stopped. "Good," Hawkins said simply. "We'll begin today." The judge reached into a drawer and withdrew another folder thinner than the previous one and slid it across the desk. "This is a current case," he explained. "Routine, but not without its complexities. I want your preliminary analysis by the end of the week." Marcus nodded. "You'll continue your maintenance duties as usual," Hawkins added. "I can't shield you from the eyes or opinions of others. Understand that." Marcus understood perfectly. He took the folder without another word and left the office, the weight of it heavier than its physical presence. What followed in the days ahead was a quiet war, fought not in courtrooms or legal filings, but in the glances and whispers that followed him like shadows. The courthouse had always treated him like furniture, something to be walked past without notice. Now, those same people paused to stare, their curiosity thinly veiled, their expressions a mixture of confusion, doubt, and something colder, resentment. It began subtly. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Clerks exchanged looks as he passed. Young attorneys who once ignored him now narrowed their eyes, sizing him up, uncertain whether to laugh or frown. But the hostility did not stay silent for long. By Wednesday, it took shape. He was in the break room, wiping down counters after lunch, when two junior attorneys entered, speaking loudly enough for their voices to carry. "Did you hear about Hawkins' new project?" one of them said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The janitor, right? Heard he's some kind of legal prodigy now." The other laughed. "Maybe I should have skipped law school and just picked up a mop." They left without acknowledging Marcus, but the message had been clear. It continued in subtle ways. Files he was supposed to receive from clerks arrived late or incomplete. Doors that had once remained open seemed to close just as he approached. Some attorneys addressed him with forced politeness. Others ignored him altogether, as if pretending he didn't exist might erase the discomfort of knowing he did. But Marcus endured it all in silence. At night, in the small pool of light at his kitchen table, he pored over the case file Hawkins had given him. It was a simple contract dispute on the surface, two small business partners at odds over profits and liabilities, but the deeper he read, the more he saw the fractures beneath the paperwork. He filled pages of his notebook with observations, potential arguments, citations from case law he had memorized over the years. And still, the courthouse whispered. By Friday morning, the analysis was finished, polished to the last line, his conclusions clear and defensible. He delivered it to Hawkins without ceremony, slipping the folder onto the judge's desk with a quiet nod. The judge glanced up from his paperwork. "Sit," he said. Marcus obeyed. Hawkins opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages quickly but thoroughly. The room remained silent except for the faint rustle of paper and the steady ticking of a clock on the wall. When he finished, the judge closed the folder and tapped it once with a finger. "This," he said quietly, "is better than what I've received from attorneys twice your age." Marcus said nothing. Hawkins leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You're aware," he continued, "that this isn't making you any friends." "I don't need friends," Marcus replied. The judge's lips twitched at the corner, almost a smile. "No," he agreed, "you need allies." The conversation ended there, but the judge's words stayed with Marcus as he returned to his duties, echoing in the quiet corners of the building. The war continued. One afternoon the following week, Marcus discovered that the file he had been asked to review, the next assignment Hawkins had mentioned in passing, had gone missing. The clerk responsible shrugged when he asked, feigning confusion. "It was on the desk this morning," she said, her smile thin and insincere. "Maybe someone moved it." No one had. It was a message, plain and simple. He spent the next several hours searching, retracing steps, checking with every department. The file remained elusive, and the eyes that followed him seemed sharper, colder, their message unmistakable. "You don't belong here." That evening, he sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the week pressing on his shoulders. The resentment he had learned to ignore had sharpened into something tangible, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel its sting. But he also knew that quitting now would only prove them right. He rose from his chair and pulled out his notebook, flipping to a fresh page. If they wanted him to fail, he would make it impossible. The next morning, he approached Hawkins's office with nothing but his notes and memory. He knocked once, entered, and placed a stack of handwritten pages on the judge's desk. The judge glanced up, one brow raised. "I couldn't find the file," Marcus said quietly, "so I reconstructed it." Hawkins's eyes flicked down to the pages, scanning quickly. His expression shifted. Surprise, then something deeper. "You did this from memory?" Marcus nodded. The judge closed the folder. "Then let's see what you've got." The morning after Marcus laid his handwritten reconstruction of the missing file on Judge Hawkins' desk, the courthouse felt colder than usual. The marble corridors, polished and gleaming under the sterile lights, seemed to stretch longer, emptier, though the building pulsed with its usual rhythm, lawyers arguing, clerks hurrying, security guards chatting quietly by the entrance. Marcus moved through the halls with practiced ease, mop in hand, uniform crisp, but something in his posture had changed. There was no longer anything invisible about him. The looks followed him everywhere now, more direct, more brazen, a mixture of resentment, curiosity, and, in some cases, something approaching fear. The reconstruction he had delivered the day before had not remained a secret. Somehow the story had spread within hours, carried from office to office like a rumor too strange to be believed but too tempting to ignore. The janitor had pieced together a full case file from memory, 12 pages of precise analysis, complete with references, strategy points, and procedural notes, all without the original documents. The whispers grew louder, the stares longer. Some clerks muttered that it couldn't be true, that Hawkins was indulging a fantasy. Others suggested Marcus was being used as a political pawn, a curiosity for the judge's amusement. No one, it seemed, wanted to believe the simplest truth, that Marcus had earned his place by sheer, relentless will. For his part, Marcus ignored the noise. He had spent too many years building walls inside himself to let idle talk breach them now. But he couldn't deny that something fundamental had shifted in the courthouse atmosphere. There were still those who sneered when he passed, who deliberately looked away as if refusing to acknowledge him might undo the quiet revolution he had begun. Yet, among the younger clerks, among a handful of attorneys, he sensed something new. Not acceptance, not yet, but the fragile beginning of respect. That fragile change, however, was not without consequence. Late that afternoon, as Marcus scrubbed the floor outside the clerk's office, he felt a presence beside him. When he looked up, Judge Hawkins was there, his expression grave. "Come to my chambers," the judge said simply. Marcus stood without a word, setting aside his mop and wiping his hands on his uniform as he followed. Inside Hawkins's office, the air felt heavier, the afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the polished wood surfaces. The judge gestured for Marcus to sit and took his own place behind the desk, resting his elbows on the papers strewn before him. "There's something I need you to do," Hawkins began without preamble, "and it won't be easy." Marcus remained silent, waiting. The judge slid a file across the desk, thicker than any he had seen before. "This is a real case," Hawkins continued. "High profile, complicated. The defense team mishandled it from the start. They missed deadlines, buried the core arguments under meaningless motions. The client is facing severe penalties." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "There's one last chance to salvage it. A motion to dismiss based on procedural grounds. But it has to be airtight, and it has to be done by tomorrow." Marcus's eyes dropped to the folder. The sheer volume of documents inside seemed impossible to process in a single night. Hawkins's voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "I've seen what you can do," he said. "I trust you." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He had spent his entire life invisible, dismissed, overlooked. Trust was not something he had been offered often. He nodded once. "I'll do it." The judge leaned back, studying him carefully. "Good," he said, "but understand this, Walker. If you succeed, everything changes. If you fail—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air. Marcus left the office without further discussion, the heavy file tucked under his arm. He worked the rest of his shift mechanically, his thoughts already on the task ahead. By the time he returned to his apartment that night, exhaustion tugged at his limbs, but his mind remained sharp, electric with purpose. He cleared the table, set a fresh pot of coffee to brew, and opened the file. The case was a tangle of errors and missed opportunities. The defense had failed to file key motions on time, allowing the prosecution's case to proceed unchecked. Witness statements were contradictory, documentation incomplete. But, buried beneath the missteps, Marcus saw something. A gap, a weakness in the timeline, a procedural miscalculation that could be leveraged if argued correctly. He worked through the night, pages spread across the table, his notebook filling with scribbled notes, references, draft arguments. Every so often, he glanced at the clock, watching the hours slip away. The temptation to rest tugged at him, but he pushed it aside. There would be time to sleep later, or there wouldn't. When dawn finally broke, casting pale light through the slats of his window blinds, Marcus leaned back and rubbed his eyes. The draft was finished. 5 pages of concise, meticulous argument built on the overlooked flaw in the case's timeline. It was not perfect, he knew that, but it was enough. He dressed quickly and returned to the courthouse, the file tucked securely beneath his arm. The building was just beginning to stir, clerks arriving, security guards chatting at their posts. He moved through them unnoticed once more, but the feeling was different now. He was no longer unseen. He was simply unread. Hawkins's office door was open when he arrived. The judge looked up as Marcus entered, his expression unreadable. "You have it?" he asked. Marcus nodded and placed the draft on the desk. Hawkins took it without ceremony, flipping through the pages. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the faint rustle of paper. When the judge finally set the draft down, he looked at Marcus and said quietly, "You've done it." He rose from his chair, walked to the window, and stared out at the courthouse square below. "This will save the case," he continued, "and it will destroy any illusion the others still cling to about who you are." Marcus said nothing. He felt the truth of the words settle in his chest like a weight. Hawkins turned back toward him. "You'll present it." The statement was so unexpected that for a moment Marcus wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "In court?" he asked quietly. The judge nodded. "You wrote it. You understand it better than anyone. I'll introduce the motion, but I want you to stand beside me." Marcus hesitated, the enormity of the request sinking in. He had spent years watching from the shadows, listening, learning, but always at a distance. Now he was being asked to step into the light. He met the judge's gaze and nodded once. "I will." The next morning, courtroom 7C was packed. The air crackled with anticipation, the defense table crowded with attorneys whispering urgently among themselves. The prosecution sat stiffly, their papers neatly stacked, eyes sharp. Marcus stood beside Hawkins at the defense table, his uniform crisp, his posture steady despite the knots tightening in his stomach. He could feel the eyes on him, the attorneys, the clerks, the reporters lining the gallery, all of them watching, waiting. Hawkins stood and addressed the court, his voice calm and authoritative. "Your Honor," he began, "we request leave to submit a motion to dismiss on procedural grounds. My assistant, Mr. Marcus Walker, will present the basis for this motion." A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. Marcus stepped forward, the motion in his hands. His heart pounded, but his voice, when he spoke, was clear. He outlined the procedural flaw in the prosecution's timeline, cited the relevant statutes, and laid out the argument with precision and calm. He spoke not as a janitor, not as an outsider, but as someone who understood the law better than many in the room. When he finished, silence hung heavy in the air. The judge overseeing the case, a colleague of Hawkins, glanced from the motion to Marcus, then back again. "I will review the motion," he said finally. "We will reconvene tomorrow." Court adjourned. The murmurs began as soon as the gavel fell. Some incredulous, some admiring, some resentful. But Marcus paid them no mind. Outside the courtroom, Hawkins clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens now," the judge said quietly, "they've seen you." For the first time, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. He had stood in the light, and there was no going back. The following morning, the courthouse seemed to hum with an energy that Marcus could feel in his bones the moment he stepped through its tall, glass-paneled doors. It was not the usual mechanical buzz of shuffled papers and hurried footsteps, nor the distant murmur of conversations behind closed office doors. This was something heavier, denser, like the breath held between the pulling back of a curtain and the start of a show. Word had traveled fast, too fast. The janitor who had stood beside Judge Hawkins in open court, who had spoken with clarity and precision about procedural errors, who had offered an argument that had left seasoned attorneys in stunned silence. That janitor now walked the marble corridors not as a shadow, but as the center of every whispered conversation, every sideways glance, every paused step. Marcus kept his gaze low as he pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, but he could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the sharpened edges of curiosity disbelief, admiration, and, in some cases, outright resentment. The eyes no longer slid past him. They lingered. The morning passed in a blur of routine, mopping floors, emptying bins, wiping down glass, and yet nothing felt routine anymore. Every movement he made, every task he performed, was accompanied by the knowledge that something irreversible had happened in that courtroom. The line he had stepped over could not be crossed back. At noon, he received the summons. A clerk approached him near the elevators, her expression unreadable. "The judge wants to see you," she said simply before turning away. When Marcus entered Judge Hawkins' chambers, the judge was seated at his desk, the file from the previous day closed neatly before him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hawkins gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Marcus obeyed, folding his hands carefully in his lap. The judge regarded him for a long, quiet moment before speaking. The motion was accepted. The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples outward that Marcus could feel deep in his chest. "The case has been dismissed," Hawkins continued. "You saved the client's career. You exposed procedural failures that others missed or chose not to see." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And you changed everything." Marcus met the judge's gaze steadily, but said nothing. Hawkins tapped the edge of the file once before speaking again. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "Since yesterday, I've received inquiries from colleagues, from law firms, from reporters. They all want to know who you are, where you came from, what you're going to do next." The judge's voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "You've shaken the foundation of this place, Walker, and now the world wants a piece of you." The weight of those words settled heavily in the room, heavier even than the victory that had preceded them. Hawkins folded his hands on the desk. "I spoke with the dean of the University of Chicago Law School last night. If you want it, there's a place for you there. Full scholarship, mentorship, a path forward." The judge's eyes never left Marcus's. "All you have to do is say yes." For a long time, Marcus remained silent. He felt the offer hanging between them like a thread, fragile and electric. It was everything he had once thought he wanted, everything he had worked for in secret, in silence, in the dim corners of the courthouse and the late hours at his kitchen table. And yet, he lowered his gaze, studying the scarred surface of the desk. "Why?" he asked quietly. Hawkins frowned slightly. "Because you've earned it," he said. "Because the law needs people like you." Marcus shook his head slowly. "That's not what I meant." He looked up then, his gaze calm, steady. "Why now?" The question lingered in the air like smoke. The judge's expression shifted, something in his posture softening, though he did not speak. Marcus sat back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I spent years walking these halls," he said quietly, "cleaning up after people who never looked at me twice. I learned your laws, your language, your rules, not to impress you, but because I needed to understand why the world worked the way it did." He paused. "I understand now." The judge's gaze remained fixed on him, unreadable. Marcus took a breath. "You think this is an opportunity," he said, "and maybe it is, but it's also a choice. If I take that scholarship, if I put on your suit, walk into your courtroom with a diploma on my wall, maybe people will finally see me." He leaned forward slightly, "but only because I stopped being who I am." The judge's brow furrowed. "You're saying you don't want this?" Marcus shook his head. "I'm saying I don't need it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hawkins leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with something close to resignation, or perhaps respect. "You could change everything," he said quietly. "I already have," Marcus replied. He rose from his chair and turned toward the door. At the threshold, he paused, glancing back once. "Thank you," he said simply, and then he was gone. The courthouse corridors felt different as he walked them that afternoon. The whispers followed him still, the glances lingered, but he no longer felt their weight. He moved with quiet purpose, the mop in his hand steady, the rhythm of his steps unchanged. He had been offered the world. He had chosen himself. Weeks passed. The buzz around him faded slowly, like ripples dissipating across still water. Some attorneys continued to watch him with a mix of curiosity and resentment. Others began to greet him politely, cautiously, as if uncertain how to reconcile the man who scrubbed their floors with the mind that had stood in court beside one of their own. He remained the same. But the building had changed. One afternoon, as he polished the brass railings outside the clerk's office, a young attorney approached him. She hesitated before speaking. "I read your motion," she said quietly. "It was impressive." Marcus glanced up, offering a faint smile. "Thank you." She nodded once, then walked away. It was a small thing, but it was enough. The months stretched into a year. Cases came and went. Judges retired. Attorneys moved on. The courthouse machine continued to grind forward, indifferent to the lives it processed. But Marcus remained. He read at night, still. He studied. Not because he needed recognition or validation, but because it mattered to him. Because the law, stripped of its arrogance and ceremony, was a language he had learned to speak fluently, and he would not forget it. One evening, long after the building had emptied, he paused outside courtroom 7C, staring at the heavy wooden doors. The air was still, the silence deep. A familiar voice broke it. "Walker." He turned. Judge Hawkins stood at the end of the hallway, his hands in his pockets, his posture uncharacteristically casual. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the judge nodded once. "You proved your point." Marcus inclined his head. "So did you." Hawkins's lips twitched at the corner, almost a smile. He turned and walked away. Marcus watched him go, then turned back toward the courtroom door. For a long moment, he stood there, listening to the quiet. Then he picked up his mop and continued down the hall. Outside, the city lights blinked against the night sky. Inside, Marcus Walker moved through the shadows as he always had, but he would never be invisible again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Feel free to share this video with others who might appreciate it, and check out the next videos for more powerful and thought-provoking stories.